Hi, this is Kowski, and in this video we're going to be looking at the major differences between the liberal and conservative ideologies. Now, just for some background information, if you're not already aware, the Democratic Party is much more aligned to the liberal ideology, whereas the Republican or GOP platform is much more aligned to the conservative ideology. And I will be using these somewhat interchangeably, even though the Democratic Party and the Republican Party are not necessarily ideologies, but the fact that they follow their respective liberal or conservative ideology, sometimes I will be using those interchangeably, so please just make note as we go through this video. So let's start off with a definition. A political ideology is a coherent set of beliefs about politics, public policy, and public purpose. Now, currently, right now, about 32% of Americans identify as conservatives, another 32% as liberal, and 34% as moderate or independent, according to a Pew Research poll in 2016. But what's most interesting is what's called the gender gap. The gender gap refers to the fact that women tend to be less conservative than men, and we'll get into that a little bit later on. And keep in mind, too, that ideological variation is by many factors when you look at where do you live in the country, what job do you have, and then, of course, you have gender, and not to mention age, amongst many other factors. So here we have, your basic set of ideologies. Here you have your leftists, which again tends to be more associated with the socialist wing. You have the right being more conservative. You have the centrists, you have the libertarians, and then you have the statists. So note here that as economic freedom, meaning fewer regulations on the economy, increases, whereas greater personal freedom increases, you can sort of begin to come up to your own ideology. Of course, they do have those tests online, and sort of feel like where you are. So if you believe that there should be more personal freedom and greater economic freedom, well, then you would be a libertarian. And again, we'll get into these ideologies a little bit later here. But how do you tell a liberal from a conservative? Well, sort of the big issues here. Foreign policy with military spending. Liberals tend to believe that there should be less spending, whereas conservatives believe the opposite. When you go to social policy, this is where very big, stark differences begin to emerge, especially here. Abortion, they support freedom of choice, versus conservatives, right to life. And these are sometimes defining issues that can mobilize each side of the aisle. In terms of the scope of government, liberals tend to view government as a regulator in the public interest, whereas conservatives tend to embrace a laissez-faire, free market solutions to problems. Liberals want to tax the rich more, whereas conservatives generally want to keep taxes low. When it comes to crime, how to cut crime? Well, liberals believe we should solve problems that cause crime, whereas conservatives believe that we should stop coddling criminals and would typically be in favor of harsher punishments. Where we also see big defining differences is with respect to fiscal policy. When we talk about fiscal policy, we're talking about revenue and taxing and spending by the federal government or even at the state government levels. But liberals tend to favor more regulations on the market, whereas conservatives believe in less regulation, and less regulation is going to help the overall economy. But going back to liberals, they believe in Keynesian economics, in which the government should create the right level of demand. So the government is playing a major role in the economy, calls for the government to intervene. And we see this think back to the Great Depression with FDR. When you see him investing into the economy, you see him creating these programs such as the CCC and the WPA, and that really is what defines the liberal ideology with respect to fiscal policy. They also favor taxation for entitlement programs such as Social Security and services, and higher spending for public education. Whereas conservatives overall favor big business a lot more in terms of being centered around supply side economics. And this is a very big, important vocab term I would pay attention to, where conservatives favor little regulation and little taxation, and they call for the government to let supply and demand, those natural market forces, to basically take control. They're going to be less for safety nets. And again, embracing this laissez-faire type of philosophy applied to the markets. And then with respect to libertarians, they favor even less government. Some libertarians go so far as to say that the federal government should not even tax people in its citizens at all. So that's a little bit more on the extreme end of conservatism. Now here you see a picture of President Trump at one of his ceremonies where he's literally cutting red tape to symbolize the red tape or the regulations. And again, deregulation is a big part of republicanism and the conservative ideology because, again, fewer regulations will allow businesses to operate and not be caught down in red tape. Now, what liberals are going to say here is that, well, we need regulations. We need regulations on the environment so we don't have businesses polluting. So you see stark differences sometimes between there. Another example here, too, is with respect to regulations with the FCC. Here you see Chairman Pai in the FCC, where they revoked, if you recall, back in early 2018, net neutrality. And again, that takes off regulations, and that's another defining example right there. Going back to taxation and ideology, conservatives tend to favor what's called a flat tax, where all citizens pay the same tax percentage. And again, a lot of that tax revenue would be spent for purposes of the military and securing and inadequate defense, whereas liberals are going to favor what we have currently right now, which is called a progressive tax, which means the more money you earn, the higher the percentage in tax paid. And again, sometimes they'll also use these tax incentives in terms of when you file taxes to get tax credits, that if you buy solar panels for your roof, that you'll have to pay $10,000 less in taxes. So that can be done too. And again, liberals tend to favor that much more. And again, that goes into the whole idea of the government having a greater role in the economy. And then, of course, as I said earlier, libertarians believe the government shouldn't force anybody to pay taxes at all. However, we do have a 16th Amendment that did establish a tax, a federal income tax, on Americans. So that is still in existence. You can try to fight it, but you probably won't win. All right, moving on to monetary policy. When we talk about monetary policy, we're talking about the amount of money that's going to be in circulation as well as the interest rates. This is different than fiscal policy because if you'll recall, fiscal policy is about taxation and revenue and spending in the budget, whereas monetary policy is much more about how much money is in circulation. And the board that really is going to be in charge of this is called the Fed, or what's called the Federal Reserve. It also is going to set rates for bonds to influence inflation and deflation. And conservatives favor a Fed that lowers interest rates. The whole idea here is to limit inflation, spur growth, create a healthy economy. However, liberals are going to claim that such monetary policies do not spur growth and can lead to events such as the Great Recession as we saw in 2008. And liberals are going to certainly favor more control, more oversight on the banks, who they attribute to being part of the major Great Recession that occurred. And then hopefully you're seeing that, again, with libertarians. They favor very few regulations and favor laissez-faire economics to the nth degree. And in this case, they favor eliminating the Fed altogether, and as well as regulations on banking. If you need to find a good libertarian, look up Rand Paul or Ron Paul. Those are two good libertarians who define that ideology. All right, moving on here. Here are our next set of learning objectives. And when we look at economics in ideology a little bit more closely, when we look at safety nets, such as Medicare, Social Security, Medicaid, you definitely are going to need to be familiar with this. Liberals tend to believe that the government should provide a safety net. So in the event that you lose your job, you have unemployment benefits. It's not to say that every liberal believes that or every conservative doesn't believe that, but generally speaking, liberals tend to believe that. Whereas conservatives and libertarians tend to oppose major government programs. Look at the opposition, for example, towards universal health care with respect to the Affordable Care Act. They did not believe the government should be having a major role in people's health care and should be supporting people's health care. They also do favor free trade on a global scale as well. Again, fewer restrictions allows for greater trade, which ultimately is going to help American businesses, at least theoretically. So again, when you look at economics and ideology, when it comes to safety nets, certainly a stark difference there. In terms of social issues, this can also be a defining issue, as we talked about earlier in the video, where conservatives favor government regulation to protect core values. Now you'll be saying, wait, I thought they don't like regulation. Well, they don't like regulation on the economy, but certainly in certain social issues, they're going to favor regulation, meaning having laws. So they favored laws that were, in their case, unfortunately for them, overturned in things such as contraception. Contraception actually was once illegal. Abortion was once illegal. Same-sex intimacy was once illegal. Same-sex marriage was once illegal. They favored those laws that were once overturned. And as a result, when you look at this overall, conservatives tend to favor policies that promote school choice and favor religion. And many of these, all four of these, are going to be based on religious objections. Whereas liberals and libertarians favor little government regulation in private matters. So it's interesting how they are different when it comes to regulation here. So liberals are, for example, against the Patriot Act, which would allow the government to sort of circumvent Fourth Amendment rights for purposes of national security, to not obtain a warrant if it's for, again, national security purposes. Liberals also tend to favor public education as well as a major separation of church and state. Okay, and for our final slide here, to sort of wrap everything up together, it's important when we talk about what's called majoritarian policymaking. So it refers to these popular ideas that come about through politicians elected as well as through state initiatives. And as you can tell that with this particular graph here, same-sex marriage public poll since 1988, you'll see a stark difference between people who opposed it and people who favored it. And you'll notice that over time, it wasn't until around 2010, 2011 that you begin to see the majority of Americans to favor, in this case, same-sex marriage. And that, of course, is going to be important as you're going to see political parties embrace this a little bit more. And again, at the end of the day, these ideologies sometimes might adapt a little bit here and there, as well as the political parties, to, of course, gain voters and sustain them as well. It's also important to note that as we go forward, when we look at interest groups, they do provide strong support as factions that lead to public policy, which we know is part of pluralism. So that's where we're going to stop here for today, and I appreciate you listening. Thank you.